Hey guys, so in this video I am going to walk you through form validation on hard mode. What does that mean? Well, I'm going to basically show you form validation with JavaScript with a little bit of a twist on it. And this is not, if you don't follow along here, this is perfectly fine. I'm going to do my best to make this as easy as possible on you, but I want to show you why I have learned the hard way to use very conservative methods when it comes to form validation. Libraries are a really great way to handle form validation because it can get extremely tricky really quickly. I would even go as far as saying that form validation is one of the hardest things that you can do in front end, and I'm going to show you how that works on hard mode. Let's go through it. So first and foremost, here are some tips. If you can, validate the entire form instead of each field. The reason why you should do this is because if your fields are connected in any way, you are going to find that you're gonna have a really bad time. Second tip, if you are lucky, you have nothing in the form that depends on something else, which is what I'm going to show you now. I'm going to show you one case where we don't have anything that depends on something else, and I'm going to show you a case when it actually depends on something else. If you have choices that are depending on each other, just reset the form. Because if, let's say that you have a field that depends on another field, and you input all the information, and then and the user changes their mind and switches something, instead of you trying to validate the entire form and figure out what that change meant in the form, just reset it. Just do it, trust me, because the code I'm going to show you now is really complicated and there's a lot of stuff that's going on. Let's just walk through the basics first. We have a server which is listening on port 3000, which is and we're just grabbing the app. This is it's not even an express server. This is just a basic node server that is going to serve up a single index.html file, which is this file here with some basic styling, some basic HTML, and a lot of JavaScript. This is all collapsed now, but as you can see, there's quite a few lines here. Let's walk through the basics of this. So here we have a basic form. If I enter a string that is valid, we see that there's a green bar. If I reset it, there is no bar. If I enter an invalid string or a string that is too short, it's going to be a red bar. Let's do some basic validation. You can see that an email address is correct, and if there's not, it's not an email address, yada yada yada. Yeah. Then we have something called method of delivery, and basically what we want to do is that we have two options here. We can get our tickets in this case, because we're selling tickets on this website. We can get it through a text message or we can get it through an email. So let's select the text message, and then we can pay by credit card or a text, or basically just sending back a text with the payment. So let's select text, and now our fields are all valid, as we can see, and we can actually submit the form. However, this is a very basic case, but what we don't know, because I haven't included any error messages now, because I didn't really have the energy to do that as well, because that gets even more complicated. I want you to know that the behavior in this form that you're seeing right now in the code I'm going to walk you through is a basic example of how we implemented when I was working at Ticketmaster, the European branch. The checkout form on that website works very similar to this way. It's not the exact same thing, but it's very similar, and it is one of the most complicated things I've ever had to work with. So I just wanted to give you some insight into how complicated validating a form can actually get. So the requirement here is that the method of delivery is depending on the state of our phone number field. If I make an invalid phone number, this goes red, and the form is no longer valid, because if you have selected a text message, we need your phone number. Easy, right? And if I switch to email, the method of delivery is no longer valid. And that's not valid because there's a connection between the payment method and the delivery method. So if I want to be able to use an email or get an email with my ticket, I need to pay by credit card, and now the form is valid again. But what happens if I do this? Well, as you can see, now the email is invalid because the email field is no longer there, but I can remove the phone number because I'm not like these fields are no longer depending on the phone number. In the real world application, we're simply showing and hiding these fields instead of having them be green or red, but I just did it this way because it was much simpler. And the only thing that is not connected to anything here, or rather this is a completely free, it's not, nobody's depending on the name, it's just a hard requirement to have it there. This is the way, trust me guys. If you have anything like this going on, where something is depending on something else, just don't do it. If you can avoid it, just don't, because it gets so tricky so fast. Just keep your fields, do validation, just basic validation. Validate each field separately as a separate entity, and if there is some type of connection or like optional things going on, validate when the user clicks the submit button and just show a bunch of error messages. Don't try to do what I've just shown you. It is really tricky. Let's get into it. So first and foremost, here's some HTML. We have the name, as we saw earlier, that's required. Email and phone number are not required. Then we have the method of delivery is required, and we have this property depends on, which I'll touch on in just a moment, and the method of payment is also a required field. Now, these attributes here, I put them here so that I can check if a form field is depending on something else. And we'll see that in the code in just a moment. So I have declared here that my method of delivery depends on phone number and email. So depending on the state of email and phone number, this has to react to these two fields. This is where reactive programming gets really, really nice. You can check that out. That's a separate topic, but I've done it the way that we virtually did it at Ticketmaster, or as I said, very similar. It's not the exact same thing, but the logic is virtually the same. And then we have a the method of payment, which only depends on the state of method of delivery. As we saw earlier, if I switch these two, or if these are not in sync, the validity of one is going to affect the other. So what you usually do when you have a form validation is that you create a JSON object that holds the state of your form. This is where we're virtually how it works in most applications. And then what I like to do is that I have a previous form data variable that is updated. So basically what's going to happen is that the form data is going to be the live update. That's the thing that gets updated whenever somebody is interacting with the form. The previous form data is just a snapshot of how things looked before you started typing. That's all it's going to do. So it's going to be a basic copy of what happened what was in form data before. So we grab the submit field, we grab the form, and then we grab all of the inputs from the form. We basically just filter through and grab whatever inputs that have a name, because if it has a name, we assume that it's an input. And then we have this event listener down here. Oh, sorry, let's open that up. So we loop through all of the inputs that we found, and we run some init form data. I'll touch on that in a moment. And then we add some event listeners. So whenever there's an change event or a key up event on any of the fields, we're going to run the validate field function. But let's look at init form data first and foremost. Let's look at that. Let's close this first and foremost. So init form data is basically just going to, I'm going to open up these two. So we are instantiating the field data, which is going to be the thing that in JavaScript holds the state of our form. And then we are going to put the field name, or the name of the input, on the form data. We're going to allocate the initial state, and then we're going to do an exact copy when we first bootstrap everything up on the previous form data. So the field data function is just going to take in the input, and it's going to grab the depends on property attribute we saw earlier. It's going to split it, it's going to loop through it and trim it, and basically going to return us an array of all the names we saw earlier. So in our scenario, method of delivery is going to have an array called depends on that has phone number and email in that array. And then we're going to return an object that holds the input, a copy of the value in the input, and we do this because value is a dynamic value. So every time somebody interacts with the form, this value changes, and that's not what we want. We want to just have a copy of that value. I'll show you in a moment why. Then we check if the form is valid, and then we have the depends on, basically the depends on array like so. Let's take a look at form data. this is what we're left with if we start, when we do all of this, all these updates. This is where, as you can see here, this is all the data. This is the state we saw earlier. And if I reset it and do this, we see that there's a default state where everything lives. And for method of delivery, we saw, it's going to have an array of with the fields that it's depending on. Let's move on. Let's close that. Let's close that. So let's look at the form isValid function. And why we want to do that is, let's look at the validatefield function here. Here we are. So every time we interact with the form, we're going to run, or at bootstrap time basically, we set this up, and then we run this validatefield function. So it's going to take in the event. It's going to run a function called setFieldState. We're going to talk about that in a moment. And then it's going to validate if the entire form is valid, because every time we do a change, we just want to check if the form is valid, so we know if we want to set the submit button to disabled or if we want to enable it. That's all it does. And checking the whole validity of the form is very easy when you have the form data in this global object. You just grab the keys, you filter out all the keys that are not required, and then you simply check if every single one of the required fields are valid. If all of the required fields are valid, hey, your form is valid, you can now submit. And what's beautiful about this is that even the fields that are optional, they don't have to be included in this evaluation, because the fields that are using these as a dependency, if they are required and they're not remember, because we have method of delivery, for example, and that depends on phone number and age, not age, phone number and email. If they are not in the correct state, then method of delivery will not be in the valid state, which means that this is going to fail, and the form is going to remain invalid. Let's collapse these things together and look at setFieldState, because this is where it's going to get tricky. Alright, so let's set some state. First and foremost, we grab all the field names. Keys are just like, these are the form, as we saw earlier, this is going to be the name and the method of delivery, method of payment, all that good stuff. And then we filter through all of these fields. We grab the value of each of the fields, and then we check the previous state. This is important. That's why we have a snapshot of what happened before we clicked the button or changed something, because what we want to do is we just want to update the state of all the fields that have been updated since the last time an interaction happened with the form. Then when we have those keys, we are going to go through all of those. We're going to reduce them down. We're once again going to go through, basically we're going to go through each key that was updated, and then we're going to grab all the keys, and then we're going to do another reduce, a nested one. Unfortunately, this is going to get a little bit messy. I'm sorry about that. But what we're doing then is that we're going to go through all of the form data, all the fields on the form data, and we're going to check the depends on array if the key that just was updated, if there is anyone else in the form that is depending on the state, or if anybody else is depending on that key. Because remember, if I changed the phone number, as you saw earlier, method of delivery needs to be reevaluated because it depends on the state of the phone number and the email. That's what's happening here. That's why I need to include everything that is depending on one of those two fields. And if we find a key that, or rather if we find some field that is depending that on the field that we're updating, we simply add that into our dependency, and then we return our dependencies. And then finally we concatenate it all together, and what we're going to be left with is the dependent keys. In other words, we're going to have two arrays. One array which is called keys, which is going to include, for the most part, just a single field, which is going to be the name of the field that we're updating. And then we're going to have an array with all the stuff that is depending on that field. Finally, we combine that all together, and then we're going to loop over all of these keys together. So we grab the name, the value, and the input, and then we have this isValid function that we're going to run to check if virtually all of the keys or the fields that we are looping over are valid, and then we're going to apply the state that is associated. So if it's a valid state, it's going to be set to a green bar. If it's an invalid state, we're going to set it with a red bar. And if it's a neutral state, we're simply going to set everything to invalid, but we're not going to apply the red bar. When we've done all that computation, we update our previous form data because we want to once again have a snapshot of the current state so that the next time somebody interacts with the form, we can check what just changed. That's how that's going to work. So let's collapse all this messy code. I'm sorry about this. This is horrible, horrible, horrible code. And unfortunately, it's very, very, very close to reality. How fun is that? So let's look at the apply state, which is what we saw here. No, actually, let's open that up again. So we saw here that what we're first going to do is we're going to check is valid. So how do we check if something is valid? This is where the stuff gets really messy. All right, are you ready for this? And pay close attention to this because this is the truth. I swear to God, this is the truth. You have no idea how long it took us to build this damn thing. Anywho, so we're going to go through. We're going to get the field name, the value of the field name, and all the form data. So if the name is equal to name, we have a function that is going to answer the question, is that field correct? So this function here is very simple. All it does is that it checks the length of the string and makes sure that it's correct. Email, is very similar, easy to check. Just checking the validity if it is an email, basically. And phone number, also pretty simple. Simple stuff. Now this is where it's going to get a little bit tricky. So here we have two functions that are going to check if the method of delivery is valid or if the method of payment is valid. Let's look at that. So we have a value and we have an isValid phone number boolean, basically. That's very easy for us, right? And the same thing goes for here. Easy peasy. We're simply checking if both of these values are truthy. And that's the whole story. But as you can see, there's quite a bit of logic here, so let's just walk through it. So the method of payment, the way that we determine if that is valid is that we grab the delivery type and we grab the payment type, and then we check if the delivery type is email. Well, all right, then we go to the email field and grab that value. We check if that is valid, because if the email is valid, then that's the first requirement. The email needs to be valid in order for us to make this field valid, right? Then we check if the payment type is equal to credit card, because remember, we can only say that it's a valid state if these two match. It has to be a delivery type of email and a payment type of credit card. And then we simply run that function and make sure that this is a valid match. Easy peasy. Same thing is basically the same thing goes for text. So its delivery type is text. We go through the same jargon. We check the phone number instead. We check if it's a valid phone number, and then we make sure that the payment type is of type text, and then we return that value. Method of delivery, similar thing here. We go and basically check, we get the delivery type. If the delivery type is email, then we go to the email field and we check if that is valid. And if the email field is valid and the delivery type is type of email, then it's this field is in a valid state. Same thing for text. We check the phone number, if it's valid phone number, and then we know if it's valid or not. Seems pretty straightforward, right? Cool. So now we have a way to determine that something is valid. And trust me, this gets much trickier. This is just a very light version of how this is just for two very silly little delivery methods. There are so many more in the real application. Holy I'm not even gonna, let's move on. Then when we have checked that something is valid, then we apply the state. Easy peasy. All right, let's look at that. So we know if something is valid or not. We get the input and we get the form data. So what we want to do now is that we want to update the form data and set whatever input we're evaluating or applying the state to. We go to that property on the form data, we set the validity state basically. And then we check. If the value is empty, then we simply remove the invalid and valid CSS properties, which we saw earlier, which is basically these two here. So if it's a valid CSS class, it's just going to be a green bar. Otherwise, it's going to be a red bar if it's an invalid one. So we remove those two, and that is what's representing. If I go here and I do This is a green bar, but if I remove everything, I just want it to reset to the default state, basically. So if it is a valid, if the property is valid, or rather the field is valid, we simply remove the invalid if there is an invalid class, and then we apply the valid, and we do the exact opposite if it's happening, if it's an invalid state, basically. Now, what I just showed you is a fraction of the code that is required to have this behavior on that form field. So what I want you to take away from this is two things. Number one, form validation, it's really, really tricky. So try your best to keep it simple. I know it's alluring to have cool user experiences and like all that stuff, but form validation can get really, really tricky. And the second thing I want you to take away from this, instead of trying to have this evaluating each field as a separate entity, try to follow the pattern that you simply fill out the information. If the field, just evaluate the field in isolation. Every field you just in isolation, and if there's any type of dependency between them, simply do that evaluation when you're done submitting the form. Do it on the server, do it however you want, but don't try to do this clever stuff I just showed you, because even this silly little sample, I'm not even showing you, there are several bugs in my code that will give us a little bit of a different behavior, and I'm just trying to get you sold on the idea that it can get really, really messy really, really quickly. Hopefully this has not scared you too much, but this is, even though it's a toy example, it's actually very close to a live production website on one of the world's biggest websites. Hopefully this was educational. Have a great day.